Open a large textile template file. In there you've got a template bear just as a reference to give you a rough idea of the scale, and also a couple of useful scale hints. There's a circle which gives the rough size of his head and the rough size of his body for a large textile. Increasingly these are becoming the same as for any other bear drawing. The need to make textiles and SM2Ys different is becoming eroded. Gradually we're moving towards a single unified product, which is a good thing really, especially with the new working methods where things are done digitally, where resolution isn't such a problem as it used to be. Okay, here I've dropped in my reference, my rough, which is a bear with dealy boppers on. He needs to be wearing antlers and he needs to be drawn up as a large textile, so I've scaled up the original to the size of the bear in the template. If you fade out your rough, you'll be able to see the template bear underneath, which gives you an idea of what you're working to when you're resizing the original. Here I'm just sort of playing around with the head and body circles to give me a framework to hang it off. It isn't necessary to use these circles, but they're really like a rule of thumb, which avoids too much variation across different illustrations. Basically it provides a greater consistency. Here in the TLA or Tom line art layer, I'm using the original and I'm providing myself with a line art to work from by drawing over the top of it. You might think I don't need a line art because the original's there, but you should always be thinking about these things. In my opinion, you always have to do a little bit of thought. You can't simply trace over what's underneath. There's a few things I'd tweak. I mean, it's a perfectly good bear, but you'll notice there's a couple of bits that maybe could be done differently. Also, this helps, this process of drawing over the supplied original or supplied rough. Well, with a rough it's essential because they're kind of vague, so you need to make them a bit more specific so you've got something to work with. And even with a supplied original to go from, this, what I'm doing here, drawing over it, it kind of helps you think your way around the piece before you start drawing it up. It's a bit like a kind of dry run, and when amendments are so costly to us, this part of the process is pretty much essential. What I've done there with the leg is I've made a selection from his left leg and flipped it, moved it over to the right to make sure that the left and right legs are roughly the same size and thickness, because that is something we need to keep an eye on. I'm trying to avoid making the body simply a reflection of the very circular shape of the body circle, because that really is just a rule of thumb. It's just a size guide. You shouldn't be going verbatim from that. Tatty Teddy's body is a variety of shapes really, depending on the angle he's at and the expression and whether he's stretching to the left or the right. There isn't an infinite variety of tatty body shapes. Generally the poses are very similar, but it is important to remember that he isn't simply a pear or a circle. So you see I've got a slight difference of opinion there at the bottom of the belly stitches, but nothing so different from the original that should cause disagreement. Okay, skipping ahead, you don't want to watch me draw up the rest of it. There we go, that's my line work, that's what I'm going to go from. Now I'm turning off the rough, which in this case is a supplied original, an SM2Y, and I've faded out my line work layer so I'll be able to see what's happening underneath it, and I can draw what I need to draw underneath that line work layer because it's very faded out. Because I've resized the document, since I've pasted things into the template, I'll need to flood fill the trap check layer, and we'll come to that at the end. And also, as you noticed earlier, I flood filled in white the blank for preview channel. There's a reason for that, but it's boring, so I'm not going to go into it. But it's a good idea to leave those layers in, especially if you want to look at your work in Finder without having to open it first. Okay, now in the template layer you've got, within the bear group, you've got the head group, and within the head group you've got the patch group. It's all very logical, very organised, and it's all labelled in advance, so you don't have to spend any time doing any of this. I'm using the default large textile pencil brush. This is the result of a lot of research on my part. It's called TT, ST and LT Sawtooth Pencil, brackets 100% K, 712.9 Tom B. And that's in the goodie bag that you should have when you're working on these files. It's used for most of the work on these digital bears. Most of the drawing work anyway. Now once you've done the patching, try and make it look handmade rather than, too perfect. Try and make it a bit wobbly. You can just use the magic wand, select inside that square, and if you haven't left, huge gaps at the corners, it will provide you with a nice selection. Then you go down to the shading layer beneath the patch line art layer, and you can just flood fill that with the darkest patch grey. Patch darkest grey, like all the other colours. It's available in the swatches which are supplied. They're visible here in the top right hand corner of the screen, and the Tatty Teddy textile swatches are pre-approved by Repro and Stewart, so we know that if you keep using these colours they will print OK on textiles. Here I'm using a custom nose shape that I've made. It provides a consistent nose shape across all illustrations, but you can't just go from that. If his head's down or tilted to one side or obscured by something, then the size and shape of the nose will be adjusted. Once you've got the nose drawn in, here I'm drawing over the stroke line just to make it look a bit more handmade. Once you've got that done, you can use the magic wand, select inside that line art circle the area of the nose, and then flood fill it with 40% cyan. Choose the circular marquee, and what I do is I hit F5, which for me fuzzies the edge of that circle by 1 pixel, just to soften the circle of white, the shine that's on his nose there. And that's that nose done. And then I'm in the muzzle group here, doing the line art for the muzzle. Doing it by hand, just using what's on my my Fate Blue guide drawing. Hopefully you can see it a bit better on my screen than I can. It's very faded out, but you can see I'm following what I did when I drew the line work for this. Looks a bit weird as a muzzle shape, but that's because he's got his arms in front of his muzzle. It's very similar indeed to what was in the SM2Y. So in theory, when the muzzle's done and the whole picture's done, it should look right, just as it did in the SM2Y. Okay, there you go. You don't want to leave any gaps in these areas. You don't have to have a very dark line or even a very thick line, but if you leave a gap, that'll cause problems, you see, because you want to use the magic wand, just select inside the muzzle area there, go down to the shading layer, flood fill it with the muzzle darkest, then pick muzzle lightest, just like you would do if you were painting with a canvas. You use your palette and you select your colours from the palette, and you know you're going to get what you want then. Not only that, but they'll print well as well. Here I'm adding a little bit more form to the muzzle, because obviously he's, in this case, got his arms over his muzzle, so I've got to put a bit of cast shadow where his arms are going to be. I'm using some patch darkest on the muzzle there, which I shouldn't really do, but As long as you don't push it too far, you can afford a little bit of artistic license on these ones. Generally the mistake is that they can end up looking too dark rather than too light. That is generally what happens. So you've got to be careful there. Right, that's the snout done, both nose and muzzle. Now going on to the main head layers, starting with the stitching layer, picking the default pencil brush for large textiles, and I hit the right square bracket key on the keyboard, which increases your brush size by 1 increment, although it's not quite that straightforward, but it'll do. I'm not going to explain how to do that kind of stuff. It's just part of using Photoshop. So it's gone from 15 pixels to 20. What I'm doing here is I'm using a little trick that I like to use. You don't have to use this, but I like to do it. Draw your eyebrows with the path tool so you get a real nice curve, and then I hit Shift and F2 and that strokes it twice in exactly the way I want it to, with a couple of variations of that pencil tool. So you end up with matching eyebrows. They don't look, well, very hand-drawn, do they? But I think for a textile it's acceptable. His eyebrows, of course, are very important to his expression, whatever that is, if you can call it an expression. Right, and so that was all the stitching done. Move down to the sawtooth layer now. This bit at the top is very important. You might want to turn your template layer on just for a second to get a rough idea of how big you want to do your sawtooth. I always start with the top of the head, and basically I make all the rest of my sawtooth match what I'm doing at the top of the head area. So if you get it right from the start, it's a lot easier to achieve a consistent scale of sawtooth, not only across several illustrations but also within the same illustration. Just go around his ear. Shape of the ears is the most important thing to think about when you're doing this, but also these meeting points where his ear is possibly meeting his head. Where the head's obscured, you don't need to draw the sawtooth. A straight line would do it. At this stage in the day though, I'm just warming up and I don't want to lose the rhythm. All of this stuff is about practice and getting into the flow of it. But if you do close up these areas somehow, either with a straight line or not, it makes the next stage much quicker. So it is worth it. I mean, I'm kind of being a bit freer there with the sawtooth because I know it's not going to show in the final illustration, but I still need a little bit of practice this morning. And there's another meeting place where it meets his muzzle. Obviously this isn't going to be a 5-layer bear, this is just my default method which I'm used to working with. His ears look really weird because obviously they're obscured by his hands, so I'm pretty sure we aren't going to be using this head again. Don't forget to save your file and don't save over the template. So antler bear stood LT, there we go. Those are the correct settings to save with. Here's a good trick. Temp autofill WIP, work in progress. Work in progress because I haven't finished scripting that yet. It's well, it's a button, you click it and you save yourself loads of time in colouring in. And it doesn't matter that there are lots of gaps in the sawtooth periphery because it takes account of those. You can try doing the same thing with the, well, with a couple of the Magic Wand tools, but I've found in practice they don't work properly on the sawtooth periphery of the bear. Just checked that I'm happy with what I've done. Now I'm moving on. Go down to the shading layer, select that. Now what I do next is I am command clicking on the shading layer to load up that as a selection. Then I go Command Shift I, which inverts the selection, and on the outer hairs layer I'm drawing in the outer hairs. This is the default pencil brush and I'm using it at its natural size of 15 pixels, which is ideal for doing outer hairs on a large textile bear. I'm doing them slightly long. You might think these hairs are slightly long. That's because you're looking at it on the screen rather than in a print. In a print you might find that they look a little bit shorter and fainter at the tips than you're currently seeing. That's the head done. Close the head group and make a new group. Rename it R arm for right arm. There's probably a keyboard shortcut for creating a new group, but you can just click the folder icon in the bottom of the layers palette there. If you hit Shift F5, if you're using my shortcuts, that'll create all the layers you need. And just start the process again. You're already on the stitching layer, and because this is done by an action, when it's done making the layers, it picks up the right tool for you to use for the next part of the job. So as soon as all the layers are in place, you'll find that you're now using the TT, ST and LT Sawtooth pencil, the default digital drawing pencil for large textiles. And it's got the right colour, of course, as well, because it's not a brush, it's a tool. The colour you should be using on this is 100% K, so everything's nicely black channel separated, which makes repro very happy. And here I'm using that colour to draw in the sawtooth again, pretty much the same process as before, so I won't bother boring you with the rest of it. Well, there's a meeting point here. There's a little bit where his arm joins onto his body. I'm trying to kind of minimise the division there between the arm and the body to make a more unified product, a more believable bear in line with Steve's instructions. Another keyboard shortcut I've set up for myself is Shift and F8, which will for me flip the screen, so it basically mirrors the image. It's very handy for doing left-handed curves when you're right-handed, or just left-handed sawtooth when you're right-handed, that sort of thing. There is a slight delay. That delay wouldn't be there if we had any version of Photoshop later than CS3, because after CS3 it's more like drawing on a piece of paper. You end up with a much more hand-drawn, natural kind of product because you're working in a much more natural and intuitive way. You can rotate the screen, and I think you can flip it as well with no delay, because it's all, I think it's called OpenGL accelerated, but without getting too nerdy about it, it just is a more useful tool for an artist. I think we're looking at Photoshop CS6 now, and we're currently on 3, so maybe one day we'll get to use all that whizzy stuff and it'll make our jobs easier. There we go, I've used the same action for flood filling within the broken periphery of that arm, and I'm just tidying up a bit there, checking it's done its job right. And you're doing the outer hairs. That's that arm done. Same as before, make a new group, name it, Shift and F5, start drawing. And making a new group, naming it, and hitting Shift and F5 takes about a second and a half, maybe 2 seconds, and you're back to drawing again, so there's no delay. Just putting in everything else. I put in the stitching first, same as before, just on the other arm. You could cut and paste, save a bit of time, technically, but if you look carefully, the arms aren't perfectly identical, but mirrored, and also they're close enough to each other that if you did simply take the right arm and flip it and relabel it left arm, it would be kind of obvious, because they're close enough to each other that there's a visual comparison possible there, and it would look a bit cheap. There are cases, I believe, where cut and pasting body parts is acceptable, but this isn't one of them, so let's not dwell on that. Okay, just doing the same bits before, trying to minimise that margin between the arm and the body, and I think I'll skip ahead here, save you some time. By following this method with the other body parts, we quickly finish off most of the bear. There he is. Body, head, legs, arms, you know, and hopefully they don't look too separate from each other. At the moment they probably do, because he's got flat shading. As soon as you put the modelling on, that will improve that considerably. Here I'm just making a group called Patch, and I hit Shift and F1, which makes a line art layer and a colour layer, although I've just relabeled the colour layer shading, because the way I work it's important that a shading layer is called shading and a colour layer, a layer that has colour on it, is called coals, short for colour. Now I've got a custom shape I've made here, which is the perfect patch shape, but you don't want it being perfect, do you? So you want it to be adapted to the form that it's going to be stuck onto, which is why I'm tweaking it slightly there with the transform. For an old style textile illustration, it would be fine to have a perfect patch with a uniform stroke to the pencil, but now I'm working on bringing Digital Lesson 2Y process and textile process together, hopefully to the benefit of both. We don't really want to be having perfection and uniform stroke, we want it to look more handmade. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just going over with the default TT and ST LT sawtooth pencil. If I weren't doing this video, I'd just dab it in freehand, so it doesn't take long to do a patch. Again, W, magic wand, selecting inside the area. G selects paint bucket. Pick up patch darkest from your swatches, flood fill that area in the shading layer, then get your airbrush. I think that's just right click anywhere on the screen, you can get your brushes up, and using patch lightest you just airbrush the lighter shading on the patch. Now putting in some cross stitching, trying to keep them from looking too regular while adhering to the curve of the form. Neat but hand drawn, that's good. Happy with those. Might just trim the ends a little bit. Don't want them looking too neat, of course. We don't want one looking longer than any others. Is that too neat? Nah, that'll do. Right, moving on. As before, got the patch on the body, got the rest of it done. Checking around for any last minute errors, mistakes, little tweaks I might want to do. Yeah, that looked a bit weak, that line. Yeah, a bit thin. Got to watch line weight on these illustrations, whether they're digi and 2Ys or textiles. Always be careful of your line weights. Alright, in the head group now, just select the shading layer and an airbrush, and airbrush on your shading. I'm not going to noodle around too much with this. This is a colour for body shading lightest. I'm spraying on there, and there we go. What's that then? Yeah, just do his ears very, very carefully. They're going to have to be done with some care and attention there, aren't they? Because they're kind of unusual, those ears. All of these colours I'm using are in the swatch set for large textiles. Making sure that none of the bear is too light at the edges. Usually these bears are put on white backgrounds or light coloured backgrounds, and if you don't have some slight burning of the periphery of the body or the body parts, then they'll kind of merge into the background a bit. Also, when we used to do them with a pencil, you'd find that those sawtooth peripheries would get kind of smudgy and messy in a good way, and burning the periphery of the body parts or the margin of the bear itself slightly to avoid it from bleaching out to the lightest tone sort of reflects that original process as well, which is nice. I'm probably using patch darkest grey here at a lower opacity. Let's see, I think, yeah, it's 50% opacity there, which you shouldn't really do, because technically, I mean, if you just go from the swatches, you can build it all up just from the swatches, and anything on the body shouldn't really be going as dark as the patches get. But if you've been doing a lot of these, you'll get to learn the limits of what prints and what doesn't print, and how dark or light any of this stuff should be. So I've got a bit of license there because of that, because I've done loads of them. And before we leave off on the shading, here's a neat little trick. Select the pixels on the body part you need and hit that little icon that looks like a TV screen at the bottom of the tools palette. That's the quick mask mode. You enter quick mask mode, loop with the lasso tool the margin of the selection that you want to blur, and then go refine edge like I just did, and it just sort of blurs the margin of that selection, but the rest of the selection stays sharp. So when I come to do shading on things like this, where you're shading a difference of form within a body part, then you don't end up with a hard edge to any of your shading. You could do it just by being careful, using a brush on very low opacity, but it's just a nice little trick. Thought I'd like to share that with you. Okay, moving on to the other leg and skip ahead. Now I'm going to rotate the canvas, now all the shading's done. Draw in some dummy guides. I don't always do this. Just make a new layer at the top of these layers. Set it to multiply using the pencil tool, but I've got a green colour just so I know what my guides are and what my line height is. I'm going to draw in some lines just to dictate where the flow of the fur is going to go. Where his head is obscured by something, or there's another body part obscured by another body part, you might find this is handy, although if you want to do it freehand, that's cool too. It doesn't take long, just drawing in a couple of lines here. Fade them out so you can see what you're doing behind them, and then select the ticking layer. There we go, just setting it to multiply, play with opacity, there we go, right. And it frees you up, that. It frees you up so you can zoom in as much as you like, or out as much as you like, and just concentrate on the ticks themselves rather than the direction they're going in. Ticks around the eyes are really important. First tick, do it thinner than you would expect. By the way, the tool I'm using to do this is TT and LT Sawtooth Pencil 100% blah 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 limited, and the limited version is especially for doing ticks on large textiles. You can't do a tick that's too long because it will run out of ink before you get to the end of a stroke that's too long. So it's really good for freeing you up. You don't have to worry about how long your ticks are so much. You can just concentrate on making them nice, making them fit together properly with a decent curvature and a good direction. So very nice tool, that one, for doing ticking. Nearer the eyes, you can still make ticks that are shorter, and near the eyes you want to make ticks slightly shorter like Steve does, and slightly thinner as well so they don't get in the way of his eyes too much. You'll be fading out the ticks around the eyes later slightly, just to give them a little bit more breathing space, but not by too much, just by a subtle amount. Now here what I'm doing is I'm putting in what I call the, I'm following the guide, the green lines I've drawn earlier, and I'm doing what I call the Animal Crossing pattern, which is a sort of supporting structure so that you ensure you get a good flow to the ticks. It's called Animal Crossing in my mind anyway, because in the game Animal Crossing there was a pattern on the trees that was very similar to the way these ticks are done. It's a sort of curvy 1 2 3 1 2 3 changing direction kind of flow. The only other style of tick I do is between those supporting flow patterns, and that's the old herringbone from the archive, where the ticks used to look very much like a herringbone pattern. The combination of the two, when they're used well in conjunction with each other, results in the style of ticking that I do, which isn't the default style of ticking, isn't the best ticking, it's just a sort of neat and fairly reliable method that I follow. Steve's got his way of doing the ticking, Kerry, Shane. When I do my bows, I try and include the best bits of everyone's work, so I don't know if there's anything that I'm really contributing in terms of style to these things. Hopefully not, as I'm essentially a ghost artist. I should be producing them the way I'm told to, the way they're meant to look. I guess over the years they've started to look a certain way. there must be a style I'm bringing to it, I guess, but obviously it's me, so I'm not picking up on that as much as perhaps someone else might. Okay, smaller ticks on the ears. Finish off around here. There is a distinct way of doing the ticks around the eyes so you don't end up making him look angry. And yeah, this is a pretty good example. If you follow this, it's not Steve's example, this is just my example, but this is what I try and get so that I don't end up, as many of the bears have in the past, in the old stuff in the archive, with angry eyebrow ticks above the eyes. We don't want that. Filling in a few short ones, dabbing here and there. There's a few dots, like little dots, just to fill in blank bits. If you've got a bald bit in the ticking, you can just fill it in with a little dot, especially now because it's become part of the new slightly fluffier style of bear that we try and produce. Good point to save it. That's the ticking on the head done. Now I've saved and the ticking on the head is done, I haven't bothered ticking behind the arms. I'm going to use an action here which fades the ticks selectively. It gives you a little alert to remind you to save. It's a very robust action. It doesn't make things crash ever, but you know, I thought it would be good practice to put that alert in. And what it's done, I don't know if it's going to show up on screen to be honest, but what it does is it fades the tick. Each tick is faded proportionally to the colour that's behind it. So if you have a tick that's over a very light area, it makes that tick lighter, and if you've got ticks over the dark area, it leaves them alone. When it's done, it fades the whole layer down to 80%, because you don't want your ticks to be as strong as the line art. You don't want it as strong as the sawtooth, the outer hairs or the stitching. Otherwise you end up with a confused image and no one can read what its texture and what its form. And now I've just faded out some of the ticking slightly around his eyes with airbrush eraser, so they don't look too bad. I'm moving on now, moving on to the left arm, doing the ticking on the left arm. And I'll skip ahead now because it's exactly the same process. Just finishing off doing the guides on the body. The body's a huge area, so if you're zooming in, having some kind of guide is handy, although again I want to get away from doing this and just do these freehand from now on really. Right, there we go, onto the body, select the ticking layer. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to select that limited brush and I'm going to change it. I'm going to change it in the brush settings. There's the brush settings, other dynamics, flow jitter, fade, and I'm changing the value there. I'm increasing the value to 145%. That will give you just a slightly longer tick on the body. Reason for that, when you finish ticking on the body, is an enormous area, and if you fill it with ticks that are the same scale as the smaller areas of the body, it looks weird and it takes you longer. So you can get away with 145%. Use the fade tick selectively action again. You could do that bit with an eraser, fading them by hand, but the results you get wouldn't be as consistent and it would take a little longer. I'm just tidying up some of the shading on the muzzle. Needed to be a little bit stronger where the arms are going over it. Shift and F8, flipping the canvas horizontally. Flipping canvas is always a good way to check for mistakes, because you'll be working on a project for a while, you'll kind of lose sight of it a little bit, and if you flip the canvas then the mistakes you've made will show up really well. You'll get a fresh pair of eyes. Now I'm making a group above the bear group for the antlers. One of the benefits of doing things in an organised and layered manner like this is that you can swap out objects should you need to. Just change the shading once you've swapped out the object obviously, but it's so easy to do this. You haven't got to worry about what is essentially, you know, the problem of overlap in illustrations, where you've got, for instance, shoulders that are behind his head, arms that come in front of his head, and behind the hands on those arms, but in front of his head, you've got him holding an object. All that kind of stuff, you don't need to worry so much about that because it's all laid up. What I've done there is I've used the autofill action on the antler drawing. If you tweak the way you draw ever so slightly, it won't be noticeable in drawing. It still looks like it's got breaks in it, and the action can cope with small breaks anyway, but you can use the action for filling in parts of the bear that saves you having to colour everything in, you know, up the line by hand sort of stuff. You can use that on other things, drawn objects. It works just the same way. And in a textile it's essential. If you're doing something like, I'd imagine, a sketchbook smile illustration, you don't want to be sticking within the outlines. But for most of the textile work, and to some extent the digital SM2Ys as well, it's handy to have hard edge selections for the colouring, especially when you come to do the 5 or 10 minutes repro work on these illustrations at the end. Now I'm colouring in the antlers. Now that action there, that's Shift and F3, and I've got that set to make layers for Blue Nose Friend illustrations, where you have a light layer set to screen, a shade layer set to multiply, and they're created with layer masks on. And you paint in a Blue Nose Friend illustration, you'll be painting in the layer mask rather than on the layer itself. The layer itself is a solid colour. I'm using the same technique here to do the antlers. I'm going to skip ahead in a second because you don't want to see me doing all the boring sort of light and shade stuff. This is using that wonderful brush that Shane uses for, I think it might be one he made or one he adapted from a Photoshop default, but it's absolutely lovely for sketching. It's kind of like a rough oil painter sort of brush. It doesn't look like watercolour, it looks more like oils or acrylics, but it's very nice to use for this sort of work. There we go, I'll skip ahead. So when I'm done noodling around with the coloured artwork there, just have a few last minute checks. If you want to get a slightly rougher style of drawing, now that's good, because this is showing the strength and the flexibility of this process. I want to tweak the position of the antlers slightly. I need to move things around. I'm just popping the antlers behind his hands but in front of his head. It's brilliant, absolutely effortless, that kind of thing. Now I'm on the head layer, and because I've put antlers on his head, I'm going to supply shadow from those antlers on his head shading using just a small airbrush. And I think this is low opacity with patch shading darkest on the brush. Putting in the shadows there. This is getting towards the end of it now, so I'm going to be slowing down slightly, making sure I take my time. The aim is to avoid any kind of amendments, so I'm being very careful about quality control here. No, doesn't look good with the shadow of one antler right across his face, so let's get rid of that. There we go. Zoom out just to check. He's looking alright. He's done, I think, more or less. So onto the repro work, just 5-10 minutes repro work at the end. Get rid of any stray paths, make sure blank for preview is turned on and at the top of the channels palette. I've only stored one selection on this illustration, and that's the head, because sometimes it's useful to do that. You can say selections in the alpha channels. Right, yeah, trap check layer's looking good, except that when I've been colouring up the antlers, at some point I've gone over the lines in an airbrushy kind of way, and that needs tidying up. Normally this job might be done by repro, but it's so much easier for me to do it because I'm in the illustration anyway. I've got the file open. So what I'm doing is I'm using that autofill technique again to create a hard-edged selection from the antler drawing layer. If I'd have saved the antler selection in the channels palette, then I wouldn't need to do this, but I have been trying to avoid using the Alpha Channels palette so much because it's a bit techy, and it could be argued that it's an unnecessary waste of time, usually. Alright, so I'm on the colours layer for the antlers, and I'm just erasing all that airbrush crap that's built up around the margin of the antlers. With the green behind the illustration, you can see what this illustration would look like if it were printed on, for instance, a dark blue t-shirt or another colour other than white. There you go, just tidy that up a bit. And when this is done, we need to just provide a mask. So the mask is a white layer, or a pale grey layer, that the illustration will be printed onto on top of the garment. And even if this isn't a textile, if this were a digi SM2i, it would still be handy doing this, because Repro is still going to have to do it, because some of the drawings, the SM2i drawings, aren't printed on top of pure white paper. They'll have patterns around them. They'll need that the outer hairs around the periphery of the bear, they'll need those to be set to multiply, and they don't need a mask behind them, but everything else here will. So what I'm doing, a little bit late there, I've saved a hard-edged selection of the antlers colour layer in the Alpha Channels palette. Maybe it'll be handy for someone in Repro. Saves them the job. Right, now what I'm doing is I'm going through these layer groups. I'm simply collecting the shading layer and the sawtooth layer from each layer group, and I'm collecting them together into a single selection. To build the selection for the mask, simply command click on the layer thumbnail, and then for subsequent layers you command click on the layer thumbnail again, but hold down the shift key, which adds to the selection. So you're building a selection for the mask, and then you fill that selection in the mask layer with white. So now you've got a white background behind all of the relevant artwork. I hit F3 twice, then F5 to decrease the size of that selection by 2 pixels, and then blur it by a couple of pixels as well. Makes for a nicer mask edge. Thank you for listening. Any questions? Just shout.